Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Jackie Yarkowski, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Nebraska United Methodist Foundation. Today's webinar is entitled Financial Lessons for the Post-Pandemic Church. So we're not quite post-pandemic, but it's always good to prep for hopefully what's coming in a very near future. Just a little bit about the foundations. Throughout Kansas and Nebraska, both of the foundations work really hard to help churches, ministries, and individuals be good stewards of your resources. And we truly are here to help you as a church and as an individual fulfill your stewardship calling. So that really is why we exist and why we serve. So we have legacy giving, investment services, church grant opportunities, seminary scholarships. Throughout all of these services, our focus is to help your church grow and your ministry to flourish. So if you have any questions about our services, don't hesitate to reach out to us after the webinar. So now I will turn it over to Dustin Petz. He serves as the president of the Kansas Methodist Foundation, and I believe he's going to open us up with prayer.
Yes, thank you, Jackie. Let us join together in a time of prayer. Almighty God, we ask and pray for your presence and your strength as we continue to journey in this season of challenge, and for our families, for our churches, for our schools, for our communities. Remind us that you are with us and you will not leave us nor forsake us. And help us to see possibilities. Help us to see what we can do with you in response to the current challenge, and to prepare for the future, and how we might come from a place of abundance and strength, and know that you give us good gifts and all that we need to be the people and churches that we need, we have because of your grace. Pour out your Spirit upon our presenters today and this time of learning. In Jesus' name, amen. The Kansas Methodist Foundation and the Nebraska United Methodist Foundation are excited to host this presentation as part of our financial leadership development ministry. And we're grateful to have the opportunity for Dr. Lovett Weems and Dr. Ann Michael from the Lewis Center for Church Leadership to join with us in sharing new perspectives and practices for a healthy church dialogue related to money and giving. Dr. Lovett Weems is a distinguished professor of church leadership at Wesley Theological Seminary and senior consultant of Wesley's Lewis Center for Church Leadership. And Dr. Ann Michael serves on staff for the Lewis Center for Church Leadership and has done so since 2005. She teaches at Wesley Theological Seminary in the areas of stewardship and leadership. Lovett and Ann are authors of a new book called Generosity, Stewardship, and Abundance, a transformational guide to church finance. Lovett and Ann, we are so excited to have you with us today. Welcome for this time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. It's a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. It's very good to be with you and to see some familiar faces among you. The book that Ann and I have done takes a comprehensive look at all aspects of stewardship and finance. But since the pandemic and its implications for the future are so much on our minds today, we're going to focus on some lessons that might help in addressing some of the issues and concerns from the pandemic. The book is a resource that you can use for yourself, but it's also something very handy that if there's a particular issue that's before you that needs attention, it's something that you can help raise the issue by sharing a chapter from the book that's relevant with an official in the church, or if you're a lay person, with your pastor. And so we hope that the book, and we hope that our points today will be able to help you along the way, and we look forward to your questions as well tomorrow, later today or tomorrow. And
So since we're looking today at these issues through the lens of the pandemic and hopefully soon the post-pandemic period, we thought it might be helpful to provide a little bit of framing about that with reference to what it's meant for churches. And so I want to begin on a little bit of a positive note. You know, I think it's easy to assume that the pandemic has brought financial disaster to every church. And, you know, every church has felt impacts. Every church has had to make major changes. But interestingly, the Hartford Institute for Religious Research recently reported out the findings of one of the first studies that really is looking at the impact of COVID on congregational life. And interestingly, their research found that, well, 3 out of 10 churches have reported decreases in giving. 4 out of 10 have actually reported increases in giving. And about 2/3 of churches report that their financial condition is still pretty solid. There's about 30% that feel that their economic sustainability is in jeopardy right now. But I think it's possible that many of those churches might have been in some economic peril even before the pandemic. And so, I think we need to realize that the pandemic hasn't had the same impact on every church or every community. And that's true with our individual givers as well. The pandemic has not had the same impact on everyone. Some people have felt a major financial impact if they've lost jobs or businesses or wages, but there's a good segment of people who have actually remained very comfortable during the pandemic. People who've been able to work safely from home, they've been able to save on expenses, they've received stimulus checks, they've seen their retirement portfolios grow. And so we don't want to, I think we need to be a little bit nuanced in how we appreciate what's going on in terms of the pandemic. And we certainly don't want to assume automatically the worst. But I also think we need to be aware of the fact that it's not just the short-term disruptions in giving that I think are probably going to be the major impact. It's that we see now, 2 years into this, that this pandemic is really reshaping, I think, the future direction of church life. And so the larger impacts are probably going to be in terms of some of the changes in ongoing ministry patterns. I think a lot of churches are concerned about, whether their attendance is ever going to come back to the full level. So I think those are some of the longer term concerns. But the pandemic, I think, was really a wake-up call for a lot of churches because it revealed problems that probably already were lurking below the surface. And it's also revealed some new opportunities. For example, the many, many churches that hadn't embraced electronic giving that have had to now get with the program on that. And so I think savvy church leaders are looking at this time of disruption as an opportunity to create a healthier financial future and to really think more strategically about managing their resources and engaging their givers and seeking new ways for sustainability. But that all begins with knowing where you stand. And so I want to pass off to Lovett on that.
Yes, well, the pandemic gives a wonderful occasion to kind of assess where we are and what the impact has been on our particular congregation, since there have been many variations in that. And a good practice here is just ask lots of questions. Particularly, you want to know about trends. You want to look at what's going on up to the pandemic and then since, to see what those trends might be in terms of your budget, in terms of income, in terms of expenses, and how do we rethink some of our assumptions? In many cases, what we'll be seeing is an exaggerated trend that was already going on. For instance, not related to finance, but related to attendance. The attendance decline in terms of average worship attendance started in across the nation in 2000. Well, 2001 was kind of a high point, and then it's been going down ever since then. And of course, the pandemic has really made a difference on that. Well, it could be the same as going on with some things that the pandemic has simply exaggerated. But you want to try always to know as much as you can. I think of paying attention as a spiritual discipline, and you need to pay attention to what's going on. Now, one question that always comes up that we address in chapter 1 of our book is the question, should pastors know what individual members give? Well, clergy are split about 50-50 on whether they think whether they want to know or not. But you could ask, what other kind of ignorance about your members would make you a better pastor? Seriously, pastors will say, oh, it may make a difference in how I treat people. But some people come to worship every Sunday and some come occasionally. Does that really make a difference in how you treat people, or how would you respond? I don't know. But we tend to come down on the more knowledge, the better. And you need to know it for pastoral reasons, as well as your role as a leader of spiritual and temporal matters. However, it's not a cross to die on, I think, because if that's just not going to be reasonably feasible, there are lots of things that you can ask for in terms of information. For instance, during in light of the pandemic, you need to ask whoever knows, for how many people has giving stayed the same? For how many people has giving gone up? For how many people has it gone down? How many people gave last year? How many of those didn't give again this year? There are lots and lots of questions like that you can see. You're trying to see what the situation is and how you might respond to that. So it's a time to reassess, a time to look at things in a closer way and ask lots of questions, because you have the opportunity with the pandemic to say, we really need to know what's going on, and let's look together at what these trends are. And
So I've been working in giving and generosity ministry for a very long time. And one of the things that I've learned is that one size does not fit all when it comes to developing a good approach to asking people to give. And so it's very important to know both your context and your givers. And I think that's even more important during this pandemic, post-pandemic period, because as I said earlier, the pandemic hasn't had the same impact on every individual. Or every family. And so we need to be sensitive to that. All congregations have a range of different kinds of givers, ranging from your most generous givers to people who don't give at all. There was a major research study done on the giving practices of American Christians some years ago. And what they found was that overall, the top 5% of givers give a lion's share of what congregations receive. The top 5% gives about 60%. And that's likely the case in your congregation too, that there's a small group of givers who are very faithful and very generous, who you really rely on for a lion's share of your income. And then in most congregations, there's kind of a large middle group of people who give, but they don't give very generously. And then in every congregation, there's also a group of people who don't give at all. And research suggests that that percentage of people in our congregations who aren't giving at all can be as large as 20 or 30%. And, I think a lot of people, if they hear that statistic for the first time, they find it quite shocking. But my guess is that for any of you who are familiar with what the giving patterns are in your congregation, if you've been studying it, you know this to be the case. I know it's true in my congregation, that there are a lot of people who just aren't giving at all. And so I think what that means in terms of how we are encouraging people to give is that it doesn't make sense to speak to everybody in the same voice. People need to hear a very different message. If they're a very extremely generous giver who's been a faithful sacrificial pledger or tither all their life, or if there's somebody who's never given a thin dime to the church. But the problem is that most churches tend to talk about giving sort of through blanket appeals, one size fits all, one voice. And so there'll be the one letter that goes out to the congregation, dear friends, we call on all of you to offer up, a sacrificial gift and give your tithe. And that one message doesn't necessarily resonate across all your different types of givers. If somebody's never given before, they're likely to just ignore a message like that. One of my mantras is that people give before they pledge or tithe. People give before they pledge or tithe. And so we need to be more sensitive to talking with giving about people who aren't very generous yet, and do it in ways that meets them where they are, which is why it's so important, as Lovett just said, to really pay attention and to know who's giving what. And so that leads me to my next point, which is don't abandon your pledge campaign, but don't rely on it exclusively. So I am a big believer in the pledge system. There's really good evidence that suggests that people who make pledges become more generous. They become more deliberate, and the more planning someone puts into their giving, the more likely they are to grow in generosity. It helps us embody the spiritual giving of discipline, the spiritual discipline of giving. Pledging is a very, very good thing. I had churches ask me early in the pandemic if they ought to just maybe not hold a pledge campaign given the circumstances. And I think any church that made that decision probably really regrets it. But that said, even though I think that pledging can be very important if that's been the tradition in your church, I don't think we can rely on pledging exclusively anymore. And I think too many churches fall into that trap. They rely so much on the pledge system, and they put all of their stewardship efforts into an annual campaign that they conduct over a couple weeks of the year, and then they totally forget about stewardship or talking about giving for the remainder of the year. Or, as I just explained earlier, I think that there are some people who are just at the beginning of their journey of generosity. They're not really ready or willing to think about making a pledge. And if the only way we ever talk about giving is inviting people to pledge, I think we're just kind of totally missing. we're misconnecting with those people who aren't ready to pledge yet. And so I think congregations need to become a bit more nuanced in thinking about how they can invite different types of people to give in ways that are appropriate to them. I want to mention just a couple today. One is that I think special giving opportunities like, supporting a mission activity, asking people to give to support a mission trip or vacation Bible study or the food pantry, for somebody who's new to giving, when they can understand the very tangible connection between their gift and, how it's going to be used, that can be very motivating for them, because new givers often don't really understand the institutional imperatives of why it's important just to support the church. And so I think often people will start their journey of giving when given the opportunity to give something very specific. I think electronic giving is going to become increasingly important as a way of attracting new givers. I think we have thought about electronic giving as just an alternate way for the people who already give, a more convenient way for them to make their gift. But I think electronic giving has the capacity to reach all kinds of newer givers and younger givers if we're more strategic about how we ask people to make their gifts electronically. And then I think, of course, your foundation is ready to help you think about how you might use planned giving or estate giving. I mean, we really are at a critical juncture on that, especially for congregations that are full of older people. The baby boom generation, of which I'm a member, we control 70% of the disposable income in the country. And there are $3 trillion in assets that are going to transfer as this generation starts to fade away. And I don't think it is too dire to say it's a do or die moment for a lot of churches. It's hard to focus on planned giving when you're just trying to meet your budget. But I think it's one of the giving strategies that congregations need to take much more seriously. Love it.
Yes, building on what Ann has been saying, all of us have gotten more familiar than we wanted to recently with expanding ways for people to give. But think about the question, how many ways to give fit your context, fit your congregation? And do it this way. Think of a brochure that you are developing or a page on your website you're developing. And the title of it is Ways You Can Give to God's Work Through Our Church. And then the first entry you put is, at each of our worship services, we receive an offering. That's one way. Well, what's another way? Well, you may mail your contribution to this address. What's another way? And then think of how many other ways do you have? And the other methods that you've developed during the pandemic, these need to continue. And if they are not working for some reason, figure out how to get them working. Because before the pandemic, I would ask groups of clergy and laity, how many of your churches, does your church receive 90% or more of its income from cash and checks? And virtually everyone would lift their hands. Now think about that. The high point for check writing was in 1994. There are fewer checks written every year. For many people in your church, the only check they write all week is for the church. That was certainly true in the pre-pandemic era. But here's another thought. If you are wanting to receive gifts and you need to receive gifts, why would you limit it to only one day and maybe one service time? So it would be like a movie coming out, but you can only see it on one day or at one time. That doesn't work very well. Also keep in mind that since 2001, fewer people have been in those services than the year before. So what you're able to do is, as you think about what those alternatives are, other ways of giving, whether it's electronic giving through your website, or whether it's as simple as setting up an automatic withdrawal program through your bank, or with a bill pay, person's bill pay system, or a host of other ways that you can develop that we go into in the book. All of those give you new opportunities. Also keep in mind that many young people don't know what a checkbook is. So there've got to be other ways that you develop them. And it's not just for, remember, This is not about technology. If you approach it that way, it will fail. It's about your mission. If this will help you extend and expand the mission of your church, then you do it. And that's the reason. And you can always use the phrase that works so well. Some of you have asked. Some of you have wondered, as long as it's something that's true. For instance, some of you have said that you are visiting family more than you did before you retired. Some of you have said that even after the pandemic, you're gonna be a little reluctant to get out, and many of you have said that you're going to be away over the holidays. And so here are the ways that you can give. That's the opportunity to do the brochure or the website page. You want to offer as many ways people can give as possible. And what you may find is people are very willing for alternatives to be offered, just so they don't have to use them. There was a church bulletin I saw from a church, a good sized church, but in a rural part of Virginia. And there in the bulletin, they had a QR code, if that's the right expression, that someone could use for giving. And then under it, it gave their web link where people could give there. Now, someone who might utilize that will notice it, will be impressed, might even use it. But for people for whom that's not the world of financial transactions they live in, it's going to be just like seeing a sign when they walk in, say, sanctuary this way. They're not going to pay any attention. They know where the sanctuary is, you see? So it's one of those things that has a lot of upsides and really no downsides. But some say, aren't we separating giving from worship? That is, we understand the pandemic. We understand we can't be together. So we've got to come up with ways that people can give. But when people can come back, shouldn't giving always be associated with worship? Well, yes, giving and worship are very related. And that's why many churches have developed these cards they put in their pew racks that say, I gave this week through automated giving or some other way. But one of the most important ways that you can recognize the various ways that people give to your church is in the offertory prayers. That you are praying not just for these gifts, but for all the gifts that have come this week in the mail, online. For all these gifts, we give thanks. So you want to have as many opportunities that fit your situation. So you ask yourself not what is possible or what other churches are doing, but you ask, how do the people in my congregation live their financial lives? Are there utilities set up for automatic payment? Are they using, do they have access to Wi-Fi? Do they do this or do that? And so you have to be very sensitive. I've had churches where people were paid once a week on Friday. And I've had churches that people were paid monthly. Now it's generally more a bi-monthly kind of thing for most people. But how people live their lives, 10 to 20% of people don't have a bank account. So you have to take those things into account. But if there are some churches near you that serve a kind of a common constituency, then it is very helpful to ask them, how have you made this work? Who are you using? And those kinds of things. Now, so we move to the next slide. We looked at the point of your budget needs to be sustainable even when the worst happens. And the pandemic is one example of that. Here's what you need to keep in mind in terms of your operating budget. Remember, the operating budget is to pay for those expenses that are incurred and used and paid for within your fiscal year. Now, that means on the income side, those expenses need to be covered by predictable and recurring income. If you are using income that's not predictable and recurring, you could easily get in trouble. So one thing you might do is to look at all the various sources of income that were used to cover your expenses in the last few years and say, is this predictable and recurring? So if you have taken money out of some kind of a special account, or if it was a bequest that came and you used it for operations, for example, then that's non-predictable, non-recurring income. There's great ways to use that for capital needs, for permanent funds such as endowment. But you really want your operations to be coming from predictable and recurring income, because if you use other kinds of income, then you're just kicking the can down the road. You've got a problem the next year. And again, there are many, many good uses for those other funds. So that if you do that, you also want to have a reserve fund. And those reserve funds came in handy for the pandemic. And the pandemic is a great example of the proper use of a reserve fund. Now, when I talk about a reserve fund, I'm not just talking about we have some excess money over here, or we have this one gift that was given, we haven't decided how to use it kind of thing. No, what you need to do is to decide, set a goal for your reserve fund, and then how you're going to fund it. For instance, it may be that you want a reserve fund that's equal to 3 months of your church expenses, or something like that. Whatever it is, you work with that until you reach that goal. But when you reach that goal, you don't put more money into your reserve fund. For example, if you have surplus at the end of 1 year, or you got a special rebate on something, or you got this or that, and you've been putting in this reserve fund, well, that's one way to build that up. But once it's built up, then have another use for those kinds of funds. For your capital budget, almost no church has enough capital funds when some equipment goes out or something, because you don't want a reserve fund. I've seen churches with what they call a rainy day fund that would serve them for another flood, Noah's Ark proportions. That's not what you need. That's not good stewardship either. You set a goal, you reach it, and then it stays there until you need to draw from it. Now, what do you use a reserve fund for? You don't use it to cover routine deficits, the same deficits you've been having for 3 or 4 years because you haven't made the right decisions to get your budget into balance. You use it for when a plant in your community closes. You use it when there's a pandemic. You use it when something really unexpected happened that there was no way when you made your planning that you could have known about. That's a true reserve fund. You use those funds and you use them gladly, and then you start building back using the same process that you used before. And
Right. So our book is Generosity, Stewardship, and Abundance. And the third part of the book that we have titled Abundance is really the idea that congregations probably have more resources and assets than they're aware of, that congregations are so used to just thinking about, balancing the budget with their gift revenue, that they don't stop to pause and think about other assets that they have that they may be able to exploit in order to sustain their economic viability. And so probably this has become a very hot area in terms of things happening and people writing about it, but there are a lot of churches that are really taking a hard look at their buildings and their property to figure out if they can leverage their building and property in a way that can contribute to their economic sustainability. I want to share a statistic that Lovett put in our book, and that's this, that the net value of assets of United Methodist churches is almost $63 billion, which comes to an average of $2 million per congregation and over $25,000 per worshiper. We really never stop and think about that when we think about the long-term economic sustainability of our congregations. And so in the final part of our book, we take a look at some examples of how congregations are using their assets more creatively. Sometimes it's through renting unnecessary space and developing a stream of rental income to support their ministry. Sometimes it's through creating creative community partnerships, expanding your ministry through inviting community partners to partner with you, perhaps to use space in your building. But there are also congregations who are, thinking about whether they may sell some property, redevelop property in a way that meets a mission objective. And so there's just a lot of creative things going on right now in terms of how churches think about their assets. We have some examples in the book. In our newsletter today, just today, there's an interview with a pastor of a church in Florida who did a very creative use of their property in order to create a large amount of revenue for that church. And I think this trend was going on before the pandemic, but I think it's going to pick up even more in as we move through and beyond the pandemic, because the pandemic, a lot of churches had unused space before the pandemic. If you think about now, the fact that, a lot of churches think that having remote meetings and remote classes and people working from home, that may become a permanent feature of the way that many congregations continue to do their business, which means that they're going to have even more empty rooms on weekdays than they ever did before. And so I think if there's ever a time for churches to really be re-examining their space needs, thinking about how they live in relation to their buildings, and thinking about how their physical property might become an asset that could be more strategically deployed to support their ministry and their mission. It's really all about your mission. And I think there are some churches that, may look at this in a very short-sighted way and just think, okay, well, we can we can sell a parking lot, or, we can sell a parsonage, and then think that all their problems are over. But I think we need to be cautious about that. This is the commonwealth of your church. And if you are going to be thinking about how you use it, you have to think about how you use it responsibly to support your mission in the long run, not just in the short run. And I think it also, it is never an excuse for a congregation to not continue to develop the generosity of their people. I believe that the church has a calling to inspire generosity totally apart from the need to, pay for its ministries and balance its budget and sustain its mission. It's a really important calling to nurture generosity in people. It's a gift that we have to give to the world. And so at the end of the day, I think that churches need to be far more entrepreneurial and far more creative, but never abandon that fundamental calling to encourage people to generosity. Before we go to some questions, I want to just quickly share some sources of additional information. So the Lewis Center website is churchleadership.com, and there is a ton of information related to stewardship and finance that you can find on our website. Because Lovett and I work so much in this area, there's a huge archive of articles, and there are these 50-way tip sheets that we have that pertain to giving. You can subscribe there to our weekly free newsletter, Leading Ideas, which I sometimes jokingly call Leading Ideas for Stewardship because, because that's what I like to write about, and I'm one of the editors. And so you can find lots of resources for free at our website. Also, of course, we encourage you to check out our book. And then also on our website, as Lovett mentioned when we began, we have some other resources available there in the form of video toolkits that can be used as training resources. And a number of those relate to stewardship and finances. So you see we have one around annual campaigns and one around the theology of stewardship, one that can help you study your congregation's giving profile, resources on both operating and capital budgets, and then one on how you can protect, sustain, and grow. You can best practices for managing a congregation's resources. So we encourage you to take a look at our website, and hopefully you can find some helpful information there as well.
Ann and Lovett, thank you so very much for being with us today and sharing your knowledge. We appreciate it so much. And I know I even picked up things that I will use to communicate with churches and work with them. So thank you. I appreciate it so much. On behalf of both of the foundations, thank you to everyone for attending. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Dustin or myself. And thank you again, and have a wonderful day.